before we talk about Jack, the person, just to set this in context, Duncan, just give us a sense of what Alibaba is, the scale of it, and this extraordinary market power that they have, not just in China, but yeah, it's an extraordinary phenomenon. Just give us a rough sense so we can start.
Yeah, if you really want to annoy anybody at Alibaba, you say, "Oh, you're the Amazon of China," and they'll punch you because it's much more than that. But superlatives in China, it's kind of, we all trade in that game. But I think it is really how many Chinese have discovered that they have choice in their lives, that they can exercise choice in products and increasingly in services. It's effectively been part of the awakening of the middle class in China to the potential that they had, because they were neglected, in fact, as consumers. And I've been in China since '94, when to walk into a shop, you were sort of getting in the way of the staff. And if you ever found something you wanted to buy, which was unlikely, to pay for it was really difficult. You'd have to go to 5 counters, and then they sort of turf you out in the street. You were basically messing up the carpet or something. So that's for retail. The same is true for finance. Going to a Chinese bank, and the same of logistics, getting things delivered by the post office. And these 3 things, what Alibaba has done is built the architecture of trust between e-commerce, finance, and logistics. And through bringing those 3 together, that's what's created this very impactful company, which is now extending into entertainment and much beyond that. So it's that trust. In one word, they brought trust.
That's that great iron triangle that he's created.
Yes.
Let's look at Jack. This extraordinary man who grew up in Hangzhou, which is just south of Shanghai, as I'm sure many of you know. Give us a sense.
No, sorry. Shanghai is just to the north of Hangzhou. That's how you describe it now.
I'm sorry. Shanghai's the north of Hangzhou.
Do you have any Shanghais that are leaving? Okay. So
all right. Okay. Thank you for that perspective correction.
Course correction. Yeah.
So this minor urban settlement north of Hangzhou. He grew up. He couldn't even pass the Gaokao, the high school test.
That's right.
How did he even get out of that rut?
Well, I think of Jack as part Irish, actually, and I know you hail from. and he has the gift of the gab, as clearly Terry has. That's why we're a big round of applause. Terry, you've done a great job at this conference. I just want to say.
You're coming next year.
And I'm half Scottish, so I feel some akin to that. But no, I think he has that blarney. He has that ability to charm a room. I think of him also as part Jewish, because he's got chutzpah. And that combination of being a great communicator, an entertainer, actually. He's a stand-up comedian. Yeah. And the ability to really understand what it's like to be a small business person. Well, he's small. He's also a business person, but he started out as a small business person. I mean, he literally, when he was an English teacher, he was supplementing his income by selling plastic carpets on the streets. And so when he started his first venture as a translation business, he would approach a company and say, "I'll translate your goods into English." Like, "No, we don't want that." He'd be like, "I'll sell you a plastic carpet, though." So I think that understanding, he's really the product of the streets. In fact, in the book, I discovered that he had these chance meetings with tourists. He was basically a tour guide. He still is a tour guide. At G20, he was showing Justin Trudeau, the Italian Prime Minister, President Obama, around his town. So he's a tour guide. He offered his services for free, which he still does. Taobao, his website, is free. So he hasn't really changed. He's remarkably consistent. He's basically the hustler on the streets. And what he did would go up to foreign tourists and say, "Let me show me your town." By the way, if you go to Hangzhou today and some student comes up to you and say, "Let me show you my town for free, maybe I'm an art student," don't do it. It's a scam. They will take you to a tea shop, which is owned by their cousin, who will demand $2,000 for 1 cup of tea. But back in 1980, when he started doing this, it was okay. This is the beginning of the foreign wave of tourists coming to Hangzhou and to China, in fact. So to understand him, he's really a product of the street. And he's kind of a product of the West as much as China, because foreign tourists were the opening for him to the world, as well as Voice of America and reading English books. So his English language ability plus his blarney has made him so impactful.
He's also a genuinely nice guy.
Exactly.
And the book, and I'm going to touch your book.
Giving you a copy, there you go.
Thank you. So the book is, interesting, is titled The House That Jack Ma Built. This is not the corporation that he created. This is not his it's the house that he built. Talk a little bit about what it's like to work for Alibaba, the whole nickname, culture, the fact that he's very high on women, which is a big deal
Yeah.
in China. Talk a bit about what the company culture is like.
Well,
the house, as you call it.
Yeah, I mean, a third of his co-founders are women, including his wife Kathy. 18 people co-founded the company, which is unusual, but a third of them are women. And what he's like is that his ability to communicate and motivate people has been a big part of it, because actually, if we talk about Alibaba is the third house that he built. He built this translation business. It didn't go very well. He built an internet company which was ahead of its time. But some of the people that he co-founded Alibaba with had already worked with him in the first venture, the second venture, and even when Jack went to Beijing to work for the Ministry of Commerce, they followed him to Beijing. He reminds me of Life of Brian, when Brian's being followed around the Monty Python movie. Like Jack is sort of, it's hard to describe. When I shortly after I first met him in '99, we both went to Harvard Business School to give a speech. In fact, he told them they're all idiots and they shouldn't go to school, which was fun. But we were walking along the Charles River, and there was a camera crew filming him as we were walking. I thought they were filming me, and I realized, no, they're filming Jack. But he wasn't really, it was just the beginning of the company. And I said, is this from the school? Are they filming us and filming you? He said, no, they've been making a film. This is my friend. She's been making a film about me for 5 years already. So he's had this sort of aura. So I think his ability to lead and inspire, and his sense of humor is important, because he does everything that you don't expect about a Chinese leader. He doesn't talk about how powerful he is, or how wealthy he is, or how well educated he is. He does the opposite. So he does the anti-face thing. Losing face is his stock and trade. And that's how he got attention. He's like the court jester early on. He really was. I think when we first met, and you wrote that seminal piece, Struggle.com, which was the cover story of Time magazine, really was part of that inflating of the bubble, which burst soon after. But Jack, was not the first. Alibaba was late to the party. It was a business-to-business venture. It wasn't that great, frankly, but his personality was very compelling, and he did bring in Jin Yong, the famous writer of Chinese martial arts novels, and inserted himself in the inner circle with the early internet companies, Sina, Sohu, NetEase. And people didn't expect Jack. He was like the hired help. He was the entertainment. And he ended up being, has been the number one, along with Tencent, internet company.
I want to talk a bit about this Iron Triangle, but
Yeah.
first, tell us about the Shanghai subway shuffle. This is so cool.
Oh, yeah.
The logistics thing the scam that they pull on the subways.
Yeah,
in
you
Shanghai.
think about it. When you buy, Los Angeles is not a great city to talk about public transportation, but some cities have like extensive public transportation, right? Because they invested. And anyway, but that's another story. I know you're catching up. So logistics is the third side of the Iron Triangle. Obviously, you have to have a choice of products that you can buy online. You have to be able to pay for them, but also get them delivered reliably. So courier companies sort of sprouted up, a lot of them near Hangzhou, actually. To imagine, there's one village, or now it's a town in Zhejiang, near Hangzhou, where 3 of the 4 largest courier companies in China come from. It's like FedEx, UPS, and say DHL coming from some town in Kentucky. Anyway, one of the things those courier companies did was realize that they could actually deliver things using the Shanghai metro, for example, but they didn't have to buy a ticket. They could have somebody go back and forth with one ticket from one station to another, pick up, drop. So, this amazing, gaming the system, and that's what China's all about.
Gotta love China for that.
Yeah, so it's that kind of thinking. Now, Alibaba's at pains to say that was not their doing, but it's that kind of street smarts that is underpinning all of this.
But Jack has also planned, in terms of this Iron Triangle, he's seen that to make this work, he needs to have those 3 different points.
Yeah.
Just give us a sense of how he went about doing that, particularly the logistics. Very interesting.
Well, 2003 is really the seminal year, the important year for Alibaba. There's many, but probably that one year, that's when he launched his consumer e-commerce business, Taobao. But within a few months, he launched Alipay. And so that's the finance side of the Iron Triangle, along with the e-commerce. And that was really important because Alibaba was not the first consumer e-commerce company. There were others, including 8848, but they failed because people were nervous to buy online. They were nervous about getting ripped off. The rarest commodity in China, other than perhaps fresh air, is trust. And so it was really bringing those things together. So he knew, and it was basically an escrow system, but it really was just notebooks. In fact, when Joe Tsai, the vice chair, was seeing how they were doing it, he was sort of shocked. At the very beginning of Alibaba, also, it was just notebooks and taking down very manual sort of stuff. When PayPal and others were umming and ahhing about how to do it and getting the licenses, Alibaba did what you do in China, which is rather than do something and ask, first ask for permission, you do something and you ask for forgiveness. They just did it. And so I think it was really bringing those things together. So, and I'm an idiot because I had shares in Alibaba. I had a right to buy shares at 30 cents from when I first worked with Alibaba in 2000. And 2003, it wasn't going that well. And it was just before Taobao. And being half Scottish, I was too cheap to write the $50,000 check to buy those shares. That was a $30 million mistake. So everybody who buys a copy, thank you for donating. But no, they've been very good to me since. But it's an independent book. But it was painful. But one thing I did learn was if you make a big mistake in your life, just find people who've made bigger mistakes. And actually, Goldman Sachs came to the rescue, because Goldman Sachs, my colleague actually from Morgan Stanley, Shirley Lin, moved to Goldman Sachs, and she's actually coming to speak at USC in a few weeks on China-Taiwan relations. She's an academic now. She bought half of Alibaba for $5 million for Goldman Sachs. Half.
50%.
Yeah, and then Goldman, in their wisdom, after she left, a few years later, sold it for about $20 million. So I lost $30 million. Goldman Sachs lost about $130 billion at the last count. So just a note to people who make mistakes in the room. Just go out and find the bigger loser. So we love Goldman, I think. Are they a sponsor? It's a security.
So 29 million copies of your book to go.
Yes.
It is on sale upstairs.
And in Chinese, we have it in Chinese too. So it's cheaper in China, actually. It's about 40 kuai. So, and it briefly was available as a fake PDF on Alibaba's website, which is slightly ironic. So they took that down. But it was
Let's
the
talk about
ultimate
fakes.
meta. Yeah.
You went there, so let's go there.
Yeah.
One of the raps against Alibaba was a lot of the stuff they were selling were fake.
Fake.
Jack himself admitted about 1% of the goods on their site were fake.
Yes.
Where are they now? Have they corrected that? How does that affect their business model?
So I mentioned 2003 is when they launched Taobao. So just briefly explain what Taobao is. There's about 9 or 10 million merchants are selling stuff on Taobao. It's free to set up. So you and I could sell a microphone company and sell it. It's free, but they pay money for advertising. So it's okay. They make a lot of money from advertising from these merchants. But the merchants sell whatever they want. And the people buy whatever they want, effectively. And look, being half Scottish, who doesn't like a good deal or a fake thing occasionally? You go to Beijing, you still see the foreigners buying the fake CDs to take home. But it's terrible. In Los Angeles, we should say that. We don't like that piracy. But there are going to be people who want to buy that kind of stuff. But a few years later, Tmall was launched. So this is the future, really, of Alibaba in e-commerce, is Tmall. This is the 11/11 Singles Day, Cyber Monday on steroids that they have in November. 11/11 is November 11th. They have this massive promotion. This is where Tmall is allowing brands to sell directly. So it might be high-end brands like Coach, or it could be P&G, and also some shops actually have their own stores. And there, we're not dealing with fake goods. Those are legitimate things. And Taobao remains a scrappy street market, but they're trying to impose rules, and I describe in the book how they have the enforcement, and they're trying to pull down the fakes. But it's not guacamole. It's a whack-a-mole problem. Lunch is upon us soon. It's a whack-a-mole problem. The moment you strike somebody down, they pop up. And actually, I describe some of the tactics that they use in the book. Miss Chen is kicked off the platform because she's selling fake Gucci's, but then Mr. Wang shows up. It's actually the same woman, in another province. So Alibaba has a system actually saying you need to adopt a certain pose in front of a camera with today's newspaper and saying or like to prove now that that's you with your ID card. I mean, they have these. China is always about gaming the system. And so how do you prevent this? So to answer your question, Tmall is really the future because Alibaba gets a commission. They actually take a percentage of the sales. And they have an incentive to have the real products. And so the solution to pollution is dilution, right? I mean, you can't really fix, ultimately, some of this stuff, and they'll try. But as China moves up to become a middle-class aspirational culture, as it is, people want the real thing. That's why they're coming to LA, where they're coming everywhere to buy the real thing. Chinese increasingly want the real thing.
So eBay, Google, Yahoo, all have tried to get into China. Amazon has tried, has got a marginal presence there.
Yeah.
Is this because they were not smart, or because the market was skewed against them because they weren't Chinese?
Well, we heard some of that in the earlier panel this morning about the rules being changed. It's like, here's the world's smallest violin. People don't really care about foreign companies not doing well. Unfortunately, the rules are set in a certain way. But the reality is, break down those companies we just talked about. Who's done well? Yahoo actually made a controversial investment in Alibaba in 2005. Jerry Yang had actually met Jack when Jack actually was a tour guide again in Beijing. Took him to working for the Ministry of Commerce. He effectively showed him around the Great Wall. They became friends 7 years later. $1 billion investment from Yahoo into Alibaba, which people were saying was crazy at the time. And people say, oh, Jerry Yang, he's from Taiwan, he's gone native, what's going on? That was the best investment ever. I mean, that 40% that they had in Alibaba just saved the company. I mean, completely transformed their fortunes. Another recent transaction I find very interesting is Uber. So Uber, as you know, had been sort of plowing into China, saying they're going to win, and was losing a lot of money, as apparently they're losing outside, although we love the service, particularly in Los Angeles, where there's no public transportation. But Uber actually kind of threw in the towel, sold its business in China to Didi, which is invested by Alibaba and Tencent, and Apple, by the way. But actually, Travis, the CEO of Uber, realized that this is a transaction. To be successful in China, be a merchant. Don't be a missionary. And I just have a whole chapter on eBay. They were a missionary. They were trying to change the world. If you watch the HBO Silicon Valley show, of course, if you're a Silicon Valley company, you're changing the world through hyper-extensible architecture or something stupid. But that's the point of being a Silicon Valley company. You need to be transformative and you have big ambitions. The challenge is with China, it's just too much. Even Facebook has discovered Mark Zuckerberg's learning Chinese, but Jack Ma's English is a lot better, I can tell you, than Zuckerberg's Chinese. No disrespect to Facebook, but there's a home court advantage for Chinese companies. So trade. Don't try to think that you can run by conference call, is what eBay was trying to do. I mean, eBay, I was trying to be very sympathetic to eBay. Like, yeah, people say they screwed up in a big way, and I interviewed lots of people, and it was just worse than I could possibly imagine. People were dumping, like, oh, let me tell you. They made so many mistakes, including, updating their systems globally, peak time in China, because they migrated the website to the US from China and instantly lost like 80% of their traffic. When they rebooted the business, Meg Whitman moved to Shanghai for like 2 weeks and lived in the Marriott service apartment so she could be like Meryl Streep, like I had a farm in Africa. I've lived in China. A lot of us here do that. I live in China. I'm really hardly ever there. I mean, that's the dirty truth. But Meg Whitman, actually, she reflected, they made a mistake. They backed an early company, they invested, a great company, EachNet, but they screwed it up. They tried to run it remotely. And when they did reboot the effort in China, they had a new project named Project De Nuevo. Because to show you're culturally sensitive, you use another language like Spanish to show that you really understand China. Anyway, so... But Chinese do that too. When I first moved to China, people said, how do you say this in Waiyu, like in foreign language? I was like, well, there are more than one language, actually. China, US are big companies, continental economies, big countries who have great self-regard for themselves. It's fun to watch them having all these difficulties as like a married couple that clearly should divorce, but they have kids, the economy and stability, and this is what this whole thing is about. And so ultimately, Jack has been a past master at exploiting the weakness of his opponents, which is what we saw with his love of martial arts, actually. It really informs his thing. So we need some questions.
Let me just ask one more question, then
sure.
we'll open up the floor, because I want to ask, now that he's become so big, $25 billion IPO, I don't know how much he's personally worth now, but...
You don't want to know. I don't want to know.
But beyond his personal worth, his commercial presence in China is enormous. How does a communist government, a single-party state, deal with such an enormous private individual who's made so much money without any of their help? How do they handle this phenomenon?
Yeah, well, Richard McGregor is in the room, and you can understand about the Communist Party, or he's here. He's actually speaking right now. A big fan of Richard, the party, if you haven't read it. But you understand the party, and the Communist Party is ultimately pragmatism. It's raw pragmatism. The PRC is the pragmatic Republic of China, in my opinion. It's all about survival. And so the party knows it has to adapt, and it knows it needs to keep the economic growth going. China is shifting from the made in China model, which is often stuff made by state-owned enterprises which people don't need, like steel. The whole reason we have this one belt, one road is just somewhere to put the steel, and put the labor, and there may be good reasons, but there's a lot of problems from the old state-owned enterprise model, which is supported by the banks, which are all state-owned. And so the party is smart. Let's not, think that they're not. They know they need China's economy to change. They're actively trying to rebalance towards a consumer-driven society, and its entrepreneurs increasingly, not just people like Jack, but the whole Zhejiang province is just full of entrepreneurs. I think it's like 12 million economic entities in Zhejiang. Dogs are companies in Zhejiang. Like, everybody's an entrepreneur. It's incredible. Go to Yiwu, go to Wenzhou. The reason you want to buy an apartment, sorry, the Wenzhou people have already bought that whole block. That used to be the case in Shanghai and Beijing. Now it's in Los Angeles. Understand what is Zhejiang. It's Mad Max capitalism. And the government knows they need to tap this. I think the most interesting thing, we talked about East-West. like the rise of Alibaba versus, say, Facebook and Google. And I think the north-south is more interesting. The rise of these southern Chinese companies in Zhejiang and Guangdong and elsewhere against the political center in Beijing. And people were talking about Shenzhen earlier, very interesting town. So how does the party navigate that? We're talking about a negotiated transfer of power from the state to the private sector, and the government is actively in pushing that, but it can't go too fast. Yeah.
Okay, let's get some questions. We have a microphone here. Tiffany has a microphone. Who has a question?
David Levinger from TCW. I know this has come up in other discussions, but the 800-pound gorilla in the room is that Alibaba prospered from a very clear policy of the Chinese government that foreign companies would not succeed in China. That remains the policy of the Chinese government. You talk about Yahoo. I remember when they realized 3 months after the fact that Alipay had been removed from the company they owned and put under the ownership of Jack Ma. The question we all face is now Chinese companies want to go out in the world and be global leaders. And how do we handle the politics when you have the second largest economy in the world saying foreign companies, here are all these sectors where you will never become a global leader, but we expect you to be open to us?
You're right in certain aspects, but not in this case. Because you're right. Okay, so what if you're not at the center of the PowerPoint? What if you are not, if your worldview needs to be slightly adjusted? All of us need to ask this question all the time. We're entering a new phase. You are right on a number of areas like financial services. You're right in terms of Twitter, YouTube, increasingly Google, although it's a bit complicated. I would say it's a litmus test. You apply a litmus test to the sector. If it's acidic from the Chinese government standpoint, things like the ability to mobilize a lot of people, get together in the square, yeah, you're out of luck, SOL. You're not going to, Facebook, this is why we can't understand, why does Mark Zuckerberg think that he can somehow square this? It's unfair. Other aspects, I would say, are not that case. So e-commerce, it's Chinatown. It's not the Chinese embassy we're dealing with. This is Chinatown. This is not particularly sensitive stuff. And the same is true of Tencent in its gaming business, although WeChat is a big aspect of Tencent today. It's actually gaming. Both companies are expanding internationally much more successfully than, say, Baidu, which I think we have to say has profited from the protection. On the 2011, I have a whole chapter on that Alipay transfer, and there's some very interesting points that you raised in that. But I think it's unfair, and I think it's dangerous to say that Chinese companies are just benefiting from from government protectionism. And actually, in the book, the eBay story is an example of how not to do things. The Americans need to ditch, I'm a Brit originally, but I don't know where I am now after Brexit, it's a disaster. But the Americans have to get rid of two things. Well, 2 words, conference call. Now, if you are dealing with a US company and you're in Shanghai, Beijing, guess who gets to stay up and do the call at 2 in the morning? It's you. And you can't remotely run this operation. Now, and increasingly companies are realizing, companies like P&G and others, they are using these platforms. Chinese entrepreneurs, it's a tripartite economy today. It used to be the state-owned companies and the multinationals. And Jim McGregor and others describe, and others, China Dream, or not China Dream, yeah, no. That was the guy. Was it China Dream? Yeah. Pre-Xi Jinping, yeah. But basically this idea of the state and the foreign companies, this battle, that's still going on, but the new guys are in town, and gals. It's the entrepreneurs, the domestic entrepreneurs. And you've got to work with them, you've got to back them. So it's changing the mix. And the interesting question for you, I think, I agree that China is hurting itself by maintaining the firewall and these protections. But ultimately, they're hurting their own companies who increasingly want to be global players, even like Huawei and others. They are offering global competitive products. So ultimately, China will not fulfill its true potential while they continue to maintain that policy. So we're both right, I think.
Okay, Jeff Wasserstrom, and I had a question about sort of picking up on this, but I want to talk about the South China Morning Post purchase. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that Jack Ma is actually very, very useful to the Chinese Communist Party in setting himself up as a intermediary between East and West. And he described his goals for South China Morning Post to provide a view of China that's not the official Chinese view, but also isn't the Western view. which sets it up sort of like when people say both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump lie, one lies a lot more. In this case, he sets it up as though the Chinese official media is not always trustworthy on China, the Western media isn't always trustworthy on China, setting it up in between. But that's a process of legitimating, I think, giving too much legitimacy to the official Chinese media. And it just recently closed out its Chinese
websites, yeah.
sort of website, and didn't just close it out, but wiped out the past of it, that you can't now access it. And that's worrisome to a lot of us who track Hong Kong, which I know Jack Ma says he loves the city and that's why he's investing. But isn't this part of what's making Hong Kong less of what it was?
Yeah, Hong Kong is, we're going to have a whole weekend on Hong Kong, and it's, yeah, there are some concerning things, I agree. And I'm actually still resident of Hong Kong, love Hong Kong. I mean, there's a bad joke here that Jack bought the biggest house in Hong Kong, and then he told his assistant to go buy the paper. But he bought the whole damn newspaper. But Jack last week, actually, Jack, as I described, so we'll get beyond the humor and get to a serious question, but Jack actually last week, Ant Financial, the unit that transferred some of the financial assets away from shareholders, bought into KFC. Jack had once applied to KFC and was one of only 23 people not to get a job there. He owns the company now, Yum Brands China. So Jack has a habit. Look, there's an element of this which is like Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. But importantly, it wasn't Jack. It was the Alibaba group. And that surprised me a bit. I thought if Jack could buy a newspaper, yeah, it's a billionaire plaything. You know, he has his Gulfstream 6, he has his newspaper. But you're right. Why would he wade in? It's still a question a lot of people are asking. It's a small asset, a couple $100 million US, which is nothing for a company like Alibaba. And yet it's a lightning rod for people who are saying, wow, you're meddling with the free press and so on. I don't really understand, frankly, why he did it, but there has to be, I think you're right, an element of making yourself useful to the government. And one thing that comes out of my book, last year, Alibaba received 40,000 Chinese government officials at their offices. So every day, there are people coming in from, the head of the postal service to Shandong province deputy governor. They have to deal with it. So maybe, again, to this other point, they have to create, raise the bar, raise the ceiling for them to go global, to exist, to expand into new areas. And how they do that is, smoky rooms. I mean, it's very difficult for them. But I think Hong Kong, is going to remain a very difficult lightning rod for criticism. People will see, like as they just shut down the website. Don't forget, though, that if Alibaba had not bought South China Morning Post, what would happen to it? I mean, the Quarks owned it for a long time, but they'd had guys ex-China Daily or Xinhua running the place before. It wasn't like it was a paragon of... The irony of Alibaba, the first thing they did with the South China Morning Post, we associate China with firewalls. The first thing Alibaba did was get rid of the paywall. So it's now free because it was a sort of precious declining asset. So a lot of questions around that. But you're right, they've bought themselves a world of publicity on that, maybe not always the best kind. Yeah.
Let's take one more question before we break for lunch. Who has a question? There's one down here in the front, Tiffany, if you can get down here.
We'll do two quickly. I speak so fast, we'll do two.
Okay, let's get both questions.
I'll be super quick. Okay.
If we can ask
Tweetable
both
answers,
questions,
yeah.
then you can take a double answer.
Super, yeah, she's been very patient.
I'm Terry Batch with Batch Global Strategies. I wanted to go back to when you were talking about the fakes and setting up Tmall as a way for the larger brands to
sell their own
be
goods.
able to sell.
Yeah.
I think it's Coach just pulled their Tmall store. Can you speak to that? Are even the larger brands having a problem with penetrating the market through e-commerce?
I think they pulled and they re-entered again, or maybe they pulled it again. But luxury brands they're really nervous about e-commerce because they're these, they're like starlets in Hollywood who think they're great, but they have to go on, Dancing with the Stars or whatever it is, because they're kind of aging a little bit. They have to somehow, they put certain products out there, like entry-level Burberrys or something like that.
How do you come up with this stuff?
The Ryan Lochteys of, some of them. And actually, Alibaba is very interesting. Like Jack Ma got the Légion d'honneur, from the French president in the Élysée Palace, and at the same time, Alibaba is being sued by Kering, which owns a number of important French brands. So it's very divided. But generally, luxury brands are struggling with the internet, and they don't like to have to go through somebody else. And there is this issue of fakes. And it's not just with Alibaba. It's the same with Amazon, frankly, and other companies. So it's an unusual relationship. It's a tense relationship. Some have decided to go, we're just going to work with Alibaba. We're going to make this work. We're going to understand customers. We're going to extend the brand. Others are resisting and suing. And Jack was supposed to be giving a speech at an anti-piracy convention in Florida. they kicked out Alibaba because there was division amongst the membership whether they should let them in. So his consolation prize was lunch, a private lunch with Barack Obama in the White House. So you have this very strange dichotomy. You know, it's controversial. And some of this is global. It's the rise of tech companies are impinging on what governments used to do or companies used to do. And Alibaba, again, is a lightning rod for some of this stuff. Jack says we'll never be able to satisfy certain people. So,
Well, thank you.
thank you. There was another. Did we ever find the? Oh yeah. Okay, thank you. Oh, you bought the book. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
You have 10 minutes. No, no. Sorry.
Ask. Go ahead.
Well, actually, depend how you like the book. There we go. Might cut you off.
Well, I actually, since here in Los Angeles, we don't have public transportation, so I'm in my car all the time.
Okay, so the
that's
audiobook is available.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Jim
I just
Meskimen, a
started-
fine actor. Yes.
I think I'm 3 hours into the audiobook.
Okay.
So I haven't finished yet, so I don't really know.
Apologies
you
for
know,
his
the whole
Chinese. We should try to give him some prompters.
Ah,
But his English is good.
That's,
Yeah.
That's the question I want to ask you privately, but that's
Yeah, okay, no
Let's
problem.
just skip that.
Just skip those bits. Yeah.
So, as you mentioned that American technology company like Facebook,
Yeah.
like Amazon, only have 2% of
That's
a market share in China. And so the question is that, what about Alibaba? Since I haven't really bought anything from Alibaba.
You wouldn't need to, right? Because you're here in LA, right? And you have Costco. You have
Well,
Amazon.
I wish I can do so. So the question is
okay.
that, what is the future of Alibaba in
Right.
penetrating into global
Okay.
market?
So very quickly, in the US and Europe, Alibaba is trying to recruit brands. Maybe it's not Coach, maybe it's the next one, bringing them onto the platform, onto Tmall. So they've set up offices in New York and DC for regulatory issues, but also Munich, Paris, Milan. They're going in to say, hey, trust us, come into China through us. We are the gateway. Jack says he doesn't need to help Chinese companies sell here into the US. They're already in Costco. They're already on Amazon and other things, but emerging markets. So this book is in Chinese, but it's coming out in 15 languages in places where you wouldn't think, but the #1 e-commerce website in Russia is actually AliExpress. All Alibaba did was translate all the stuff on Taobao, Tmall, into Russian, and they became the #1 website overnight. Ukraine, Bulgaria, Brazil, a lot of these places. And he's become an icon. The American dream is remade in China, in some people's eyes. And Jack is a symbol of that, but also, who doesn't like cheap factory price stuff? And that's what AliExpress is doing in emerging markets. So here in the US, the people who know Alibaba, and the same is true in Europe. The rich bankers, yeah, I had 1 million shares of Alibaba, which I hate to hear. And then it's the taxi drivers, it's the Uber drivers. They know here, like taxi drivers buy mangoes on AliExpress and deliver between the Uber drivers. They're like ultimate small entrepreneurs. So the upper crust in the US knows Alibaba. The emerging crust, if you will, the immigrants, the hard workers. The middle classes, the middle people don't really need to know much about it, except when you go to the movies. If you go to see Star Trek, you'll see the Alibaba pictures. Many other movies now, Alibaba's from Pasadena is getting into that. But you don't need to know Alibaba yet in these places. The market's already sewn up for now, but wait for technology shift. He's coming eventually.
I'll buy the stock now.
Duncan, thank you. The book is for sale upstairs. It's a great book. Duncan, thank you so much for that. Lunch now, 12:30, and we'll see you after that.